Started like most gossip does, innocent, almost laughable. A few weeks ago, during a block party in our quiet suburban neighborhood, I overheard two of my neighbors exchanging hushed whispers. "Have you noticed how often Emily's at Peter's place?" one asked, her voice a blend of curiosity and judgment. My wife, Emily, was standing just a few feet away, chatting animatedly with Peter, our recently divorced neighbor. She was smiling, her laughter carrying over the hum of conversations, and I brushed the comment off as harmless neighborhood speculation. Emily and I had been married for 12 years. We had built a life together filled with weekend barbecues, PTA meetings, and Netflix marathons. She was the kind of woman who could light up a room with her presence. A magnet for attention, but always grounded, always mine. So, when the whispers started circulating, I dismissed them. Emily had always been warm and generous, and Peter had been struggling since his divorce. It was natural she'd want to help. But something gnawed at me in the days that followed. Maybe it was the way she smiled at him, a smile that seemed reserved for someone special, or how her errands now seemed to take twice as long. Still, I buried my unease, chalking it up to my imagination or the mundane strain of long-term marriage. That was until last Thursday. I had left work early, intending to surprise Emily with dinner reservations at her favorite Italian place. As I pulled into our driveway, I noticed Peter's car parked along the curb in front of his house. My heart sank, but I shook off the feeling and walked toward our home. The laughter I heard coming from inside, though, stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't the sound of kids playing or her chatting with a friend. It was just Emily's voice and his. Through the sheer curtains, I saw them in the living room. She was sitting on the couch, her body angled toward him, her hand brushing his as she handed him a glass of wine. There was nothing overtly suspicious about it, but the air felt charged, like I was intruding on a private moment. I left before either of them could see me, driving aimlessly around town with no destination in mind. My thoughts spiraled. Was I being paranoid? Could there be something more to those whispers? By the time I returned home that evening, Peter's car was gone, and Emily greeted me at the door with her usual warmth, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. "I made lasagna," she said with a smile, kissing my cheek. Her lips felt warm but foreign, and for the first time in years, I questioned if I truly knew her. As we sat down to eat, I studied her closely. She was animated, telling me about her day, but my focus shifted to the tiny details I'd never noticed before. The way her phone seemed glued to her hand, lighting up with notifications she didn't share. The faint scent of cologne, not mine, lingering when she leaned in to pass the salt. I needed to know. I resolved to find the truth, even if it shattered everything. The next morning, I woke with a heavy knot in my stomach. Emily was already up, humming to herself in the kitchen as the smell of coffee wafted through the house. She greeted me with a cheerful, "Morning, sleepyhead." Like everything was normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. As I sipped my coffee, I casually asked, "You've been spending a lot of time helping Peter, huh? Is he doing okay?" Emily didn't miss a beat. "Oh yeah, poor guy, you know? The divorce really hit him hard. I've been helping him set up his new place, giving him tips for decorating and stuff." "Why?" I shrugged, playing it cool. "Just curious. The neighbors were talking about how close you've gotten." Her smile faltered for just a moment, a flicker of something. Irritation? Guilt? Crossing her face before she waved it off. "People love to gossip. You know how this neighborhood is." I wanted to press further, but I knew I'd have to tread carefully. If there was something going on, outright accusations would only drive it deeper into the shadows. That day at work, I couldn't focus. The thought of Emily's laugh, Peter's proximity, the faint smell of cologne. It all played on a loop in my mind. I scrolled through our joint calendar on my phone, noting her plans for the week. A lunch with Sarah on Wednesday caught my eye. Sarah, her best friend, was usually chatty about their outings, but she hadn't mentioned anything to me lately. I decided to investigate. Wednesday came and I left work early again. Emily had mentioned the lunch when she left that morning, her breezy tone not giving me any reason to doubt her. But instead of heading home, I drove to the little cafe she and Sarah frequented. Her car wasn't there. I parked across the street and waited, scrolling aimlessly on my phone as minutes turned to an hour. When I was convinced she wasn't coming, I called Sarah. "Hey, Sarah," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Did you and Emily have a good lunch today?" There was a pause on the other end. "Lunch? Oh no, we didn't meet up today. I've been home all day with the kids." "Why?" My grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Oh, no reason. I must have mixed up the days." "Thanks, though." Hanging up, my chest tightened with a mix of anger and fear. If Emily wasn't with Sarah, then where was she? When I got home, I acted like nothing was wrong. Emily came back about an hour later, carrying a shopping bag and humming to herself. "Find anything good?" I asked, nodding toward the bag. She looked startled for a fraction of a second. "Oh, just a few things for the house. You know, Peter's been asking about throw pillows and curtains, trying to make his place feel more like home." The knot in my stomach twisted further. That night I couldn't sleep. Lying awake, staring at the ceiling, I knew I couldn't let this go. If Emily was lying about something as simple as lunch, what else might she be hiding? I decided I needed proof. The next morning, while Emily was in the shower, I grabbed her phone. It was locked, but I knew her passcode, our anniversary date. My hands trembled as I scrolled through her messages, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear myself think. Most of the conversations seemed innocent. Chats with Sarah, group texts with her mom and sister. But then I saw it. A string of messages from a contact saved as work. "Work. Thanks for today. I needed that. Emily. Anytime. You know I'm here for you. Work. You're amazing. I don't know how I'd get through this without you. Emily. You're pretty amazing yourself." My stomach churned as I scrolled further, each message more intimate than the last. Work wasn't her office, it was Peter. The shower turned off and I hurriedly put her phone back. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. The whispers weren't just gossip. They were true. The realization hit me like a gut punch. The texts weren't outright damning, but they painted a picture of a relationship far closer than Emily had let on. I couldn't confront her yet, not without more evidence. Over breakfast, Emily was her usual self, chatting about the weekend plans and whether we should finally tackle cleaning out the garage. I watched her closely, wondering how she could act so normal, so loving, when I now suspected her of betrayal. "You're quiet this morning," she said, tilting her head. "Just tired," I replied, forcing a smile. "Didn't sleep well. Too much coffee late at night, huh?" She chuckled, leaning over to squeeze my hand. "I told you to cut back." The warmth in her touch felt like a cruel joke. That day I called a private investigator. His name was Mark, and he came recommended by a friend who had gone through a messy divorce. "I don't want to jump to conclusions," I told him, "but I need to know if there's something going on." Mark was professional, calm. "I understand. I'll start discreetly. Do you know her routines? Places she frequents?" I gave him everything I could, her favorite cafes, the gym she rarely visited but kept a membership for, and of course Peter's address. "Give me a week," Mark said. "If there's anything to find, I'll find it." The waiting was agony. Every moment I wasn't working or occupied with errands, my mind replayed those texts, those stolen glances I'd noticed between Emily and Peter. She seemed oblivious, carrying on as if everything was fine. A few days later, Emily said she was meeting Peter to discuss some decor ideas for his place. "He's hopeless with this stuff," she said, laughing. "I swear, if I don't help him, he'll end up with mismatched curtains and plastic plants. Just don't make him too dependent on you," I said, keeping my tone light. She waved me off. "Oh, please, he's harmless." After she left, I texted Mark. "She's on her way to his house now," I wrote. "Got it," he replied. I spent the afternoon restless, jumping every time my phone buzzed. By evening, Mark called. "She stayed for about 3 hours, he said. They seemed friendly, but nothing overtly suspicious. I'll keep digging." His words offered little comfort. 3 hours? That didn't seem like a quick conversation about throw pillows. That night, I was distant, barely speaking as we ate dinner. Emily noticed. "Are you okay?" she asked, her brow furrowing with concern.
Yeah, elite.
"Just a lot on my mind with work." She reached across the table, taking my hand. "You can talk to me, you know?" The irony stung. A few more days passed before Mark contacted me again. This time, his tone was different. He'd found something. "We need to meet in person," he said. "Tomorrow, if you can." "What did you find?" I pressed, my heart hammering. "It's better if I show you," Mark said. The next morning, I met him at a small diner on the edge of town. He slid a manila envelope across the table. "I followed them again yesterday," he said. She met him at his house, just like before. But this time, I opened the envelope, my hands trembling. Inside were photos. Emily and Peter standing close in his driveway, her hand on his arm, their heads leaning together in what looked like an intimate conversation. Another photo showed her leaving his house hours later, her hair disheveled and her makeup slightly smudged. It was the final photo, though, that made my blood run cold. Emily and Peter, standing in the kitchen through an open window, their bodies close. His hand was on her waist, her head tilted back in laughter. "I'm sorry," Mark said softly. I couldn't speak. My throat felt tight, my chest heavy. The evidence was damning. It wasn't just texts or suspicions anymore. There was something real happening between them. Driving home, I rehearsed what I would say, how I would confront her, demand the truth. But when I walked through the door and saw her sitting on the couch, smiling up at me as if nothing was wrong, I froze. "Hey, babe," she said, her smile bright. "How was your day?" It was a simple question, but the weight of it crushed me. How could she sit there so casually, knowing what she was doing? I didn't confront her that night. I needed time to think, to plan my next move. But the distance between us grew, the air thick with unspoken truths. I couldn't look at her the same way anymore. By the time the weekend rolled around, my unease had transformed into quiet resolve. Mark's photos haunted me, but I still couldn't bring myself to confront Emily. Not yet. I needed her to admit it, or to catch her so undeniably in the act that she couldn't lie her way out of it. That Saturday morning, Emily floated around the kitchen, humming as she prepped breakfast. "I was thinking we should have a lazy day," she said, sliding a plate of pancakes in front of me. "Just you, me, and a good movie marathon." Her cheerfulness felt like nails on a chalkboard. It was too much, too fake. "That sounds nice," I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. But inside I was seething. I couldn't tell if her suggestion was a genuine attempt to reconnect or a calculated move to distract me. Either way, it didn't work. Later that afternoon, I told her I needed to run errands. She kissed me goodbye without a second thought, settling onto the couch with her phone and a cup of tea. As I pulled out of the driveway, I parked a few houses down, waiting to see if she'd leave. About 20 minutes later, she did. She walked briskly to her car, glancing around like someone who didn't want to be seen. My stomach churned. I followed her at a distance, careful not to get too close. She drove straight to Peter's house. My chest tightened as I watched her knock on the door, her body language casual but her smile anything but. He opened the door, and they exchanged a look that spoke volumes. The door closed behind them, and I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Part of me wanted to storm in, to demand answers, but I knew that wouldn't get me what I wanted. After about an hour, Mark texted me. "I'm outside the house. You want me to do anything?"
No, irraplia.
"Just document." He sent me a few more photos over the next hour. Emily stepping out onto Peter's porch, her hair windswept and her face glowing in a way I hadn't seen in months. Peter stood behind her, his hand brushing her lower back as he whispered something that made her laugh. I drove home, barely able to see the road through the haze of anger and heartbreak. When Emily returned later that evening, she was carrying a shopping bag. "I stopped by the boutique on my way back," she said breezily. "Picked up a couple of things for the house." "Nice," I said flatly. She paused, studying me. "You okay? You've been quiet lately." I'm fine. That night, as she slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind churned with possibilities. Should I confront her now? Wait until I had more evidence? Or do something that would make her finally confess? The next morning, I decided to test her. Over coffee, I casually brought up Peter. He's lucky to have a friend like you, I said, forcing a smile. You've really been there for him. Emily's face flickered with something. Guilt?
Surprise?
It was fleeting, but it was there. Yeah, well, I just feel bad for him, you know? She said, stirring her coffee. He doesn't have anyone else right now. Her words sounded rehearsed, like something she'd been practicing. That afternoon, I called Mark again. I need you to dig deeper, I told him. Whatever you find, I need it fast. Mark's tone was grim. I'll do what I can. But, Jack, are you ready for what you might find? I'm already living it, I said, my voice hollow. By evening, Emily seemed more at ease, laughing at a show we were watching, her hand resting on mine as if nothing had changed. But everything had. And soon, she wouldn't be able to pretend anymore. By Monday, my determination had turned into a quiet, simmering resolve. Every word Emily said, every glance she stole at her phone, felt calculated. I was watching her closer now, dissecting every movement, every hesitation, every lie disguised as an explanation. When she told me that morning she'd be working late, my stomach twisted. Big project at the office, she said, brushing her hair into a loose ponytail. Might not be home until after dinner. I nodded, biting back the 1,000 questions I wanted to ask. Instead, I played along. No problem. I'll grab takeout. She kissed me on the cheek, her lips soft and warm, but the gesture felt foreign. She left, and as soon as her car disappeared down the street, I called Mark. She says she's working late, I told him. Can you confirm where she actually goes? Already on it, Mark replied. The rest of the day was excruciating. Every minute dragged, my mind replaying the last few weeks. Every inconsistency, every suspicious glance. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was pacing the living room, waiting for Mark's call. Finally, around 8:30, my phone buzzed. She's not at work, Mark said. She went to Peter's house again. Same as before. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone so hard I thought it might crack. Did you see anything? Nothing physical yet, Mark said. But I'd bet my paycheck they're not just chatting in there. After the call, I sat in silence, staring at the framed photos on the mantel. Emily and me on our wedding day, grinning like we'd won the lottery. A family portrait from a beach vacation a few summers ago. They felt like relics from a life that wasn't mine anymore. When she came home an hour later, she seemed distracted. Sorry I'm late, she said, dropping her bag on the counter. Work ran longer than I expected. I forced a smile, nodding.
No worries.
Grabbed some Chinese food. It's in the fridge if you're hungry. Her eyes lingered on me for a moment, searching, as if she could sense the shift in the air. You okay? Yeah, I said, keeping my tone light. Just tired. The next few days followed the same pattern. Emily's excuses for being out grew flimsier, and her phone was practically glued to her hand. Mark kept tracking her movements, each report a dagger to the heart. By Wednesday, he sent me a photo that left no room for doubt. It was Emily and Peter standing on his porch. Her hand was on his chest, and his lips were on hers. I stared at the image, my chest tightening until I could barely breathe. There it was, the proof I dreaded but knew I needed. That night, as Emily sat across from me at the dinner table, chatting about her day, I felt a surge of anger I could barely contain. How could she sit there, smiling, talking about work deadlines and errands, when she was actively betraying me? Peter must really appreciate all the help you've been giving him, I said, my voice calm but deliberate. She froze for half a second, a tiny, imperceptible pause before forcing a laugh. Oh, he's hopeless. But yeah, I think he's getting the hang of it now. I nodded, watching her closely. That's good. Maybe he'll start relying on someone else soon. Her fork clinked against her plate as she set it down, her smile faltering. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, I said, standing to clear the table. Just an observation. She didn't press further, but I could feel her watching me as I rinsed the dishes. That night, lying in bed beside her, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. I had the proof now, but the question loomed. What would I do with it? Would I confront her? Expose her lies? Or was there another way to make her face the consequences of what she'd done? The cracks in our marriage were no longer invisible. They were gaping fissures impossible to ignore, and soon, one way or another, they'd bring everything crashing down. The photograph of Emily and Peter stayed burned in my mind, playing on repeat like a damning loop I couldn't shut off. Every time I looked at her, I felt a mix of fury, heartbreak, and disbelief. How had it come to this? How had the woman I'd shared my life with become a stranger? A liar. I couldn't keep pretending. Not anymore. The next day I called Mark. I need everything you've got, I said, my voice flat. Pictures, timestamps, any recordings. I'm going to confront her. Are you sure you're ready for that? Mark asked cautiously. I've been living in this limbo long enough, I said. It's time she answers for what she's done. Mark promised to drop everything off that evening. As I hung up, I paced the house, thinking through every possible scenario. I knew Emily. She tried to deny it at first, maybe even turn it back on me, claim I was paranoid or overreacting. But the evidence was undeniable. By the time Mark arrived, I felt like a coiled spring ready to snap. He handed me a thick envelope, his expression somber. Good luck, Jack, he said. Thanks, I muttered, shutting the door behind him. Inside, I spread the photos and printed reports across the dining table, each one a new nail in the coffin of our marriage. Emily and Peter at his house, at a restaurant across town, in a park sitting close, their hands brushing. And, of course, the kiss on the porch, the kiss that had shattered any last shred of doubt. I sat there for hours, staring at the evidence, rehearsing what I'd say. Confronting her wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. When Emily came home, I was waiting for her in the living room, the envelope resting on the coffee table like a loaded gun. Hey, she said, setting her purse down. You're home early. Sit down, I said, my voice low and steady. Her brow furrowed. What's going on? Just sit. She hesitated but complied, her posture stiff with unease. I slid the envelope toward her. Open it. What is this? She asked, her voice wavering. Just open it, Emily. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out the photos. The first one made her eyes widen. By the third, she looked pale. When she reached the photo of the kiss, her breath hitched, and she dropped the stack onto the table. Jack, she started, her voice barely above a whisper. Don't, I said sharply, cutting her off. Don't lie to me. Don't try to explain it away. I know, Emily. I know everything. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. Not yet. How long? I demanded. She looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. A few months, she admitted, her voice breaking. A few months, I repeated, my anger rising. And you didn't think I'd notice? You didn't think I deserved to know? It wasn't supposed to happen, she said, her words tumbling out. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was lonely, Jack. You've been so distant lately. I let out a bitter laugh. Distant? You think I'm the problem here? You've been sneaking around with Peter while I've been breaking my back to provide for us. She flinched but didn't argue. Do you love him? I asked, the question cutting me more than I wanted to admit. She hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. I stood, pacing the room, my mind racing. Do you even realize what you've done? I asked. Not just to me, but to us? To everything we've built together. I'm sorry, she said, tears streaming down her face. I never wanted to hurt you. Well, congratulations, I snapped. You did. You destroyed everything. The silence that followed was deafening. the weight of her betrayal suffocating. "I need time to think," I finally said, my voice hoarse. "You can stay here tonight, but tomorrow I want you out." "Jack, please, don't," I said, cutting her off again. "You made your choice, Emily. Now, I'm making mine." I left the room, slamming the bedroom door behind me. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. Tomorrow, the real decisions would begin. The next morning, the air in the house was thick with tension. Emily had spent the night on the couch, though I doubted either of us got much sleep. I woke up feeling drained but resolute. The weight of her betrayal still sat heavily on my chest. But at least now, the lies were out in the open. When I came downstairs, Emily was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee cradled in her hands. Her eyes were red and swollen, and her face looked pale, almost fragile. For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity, but I pushed it aside. She'd made her choices. "I'm going to pack a bag," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good," I replied, keeping my tone even. She flinched at the coldness in my voice but didn't argue. As she stood to leave the room, I added, "Do me a favor and tell Peter to stay far away from this house. If I see him here, things won't end well." Emily nodded, her shoulders slumping as she disappeared upstairs. I sat at the table, staring into my coffee, the silence of the house deafening. Every creak, every distant sound felt amplified, as if the walls themselves were mourning the collapse of our life together. A little while later, Emily reappeared, a small suitcase in hand. She stopped at the door, her eyes searching mine. "Jack, I never stopped loving you," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't respond. Couldn't. She waited for a moment, as if hoping for some sign of forgiveness, but I stayed silent. With a soft sigh, she turned and left, the sound of the door closing behind her echoing in the empty house. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I went through the motions, cleaning up, answering emails, pretending like everything was normal. But inside, I was unraveling. I couldn't stop replaying the moments that had led us here. Every time she smiled at me, every excuse she made, every lie she told. It all felt so deliberate now, so cruel. That evening, I decided to call Mark. "I need to know more about Peter," I said. "Everything you can find." Mark hesitated. "Jack, are you sure about this? You've already got enough to." "I don't care," I interrupted. "I want to know who he is, what he's about, why he thought he could come into my life and destroy it. Can you do it or not?" "Of course," Mark said. "I'll get started right away." The next few days were a blur of anger and grief. Emily texted me a couple of times, saying she wanted to talk, but I didn't respond. Couldn't. Seeing her name on my phone was like a knife twisting in my chest. On the third day, Mark called with an update. "I looked into Peter," he said. "Turns out, this isn't the first time he's been involved in something like this." "What do you mean?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "He had an affair with another married woman before his divorce," Mark explained. "It ended badly. The husband found out and nearly beat him to a pulp. That's why Peter moved here. To start fresh, I guess." The revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just some innocent mistake or a moment of weakness. Peter had a pattern. He preyed on vulnerable women, and Emily had fallen right into his trap. "Thanks, Mark," I said, my voice cold. "I'll take it from here." That night, I sat in the living room, staring at the empty space where Emily's favorite vase used to sit. The house felt foreign without her, like a shell of the home we'd built together. But as much as it hurt, I knew I couldn't let this break me. I grabbed a notebook and began writing down everything I needed to do. Change the locks, file for separation, meet with a lawyer. This was no longer about saving what was lost. It was about protecting myself, rebuilding, and finding a way to move forward. Emily had chosen Peter, but now it was my turn to choose myself. The house felt quieter than it ever had, an unsettling void where Emily's presence used to linger. Days turned into weeks, and with every passing hour, I worked to reclaim my life, brick by brick, from the wreckage her betrayal had left behind. I spent my mornings at work, pouring myself into projects with a focus I hadn't felt in years. My colleagues probably thought I was on some productivity high, but the truth was simpler. Work kept me from drowning in the silence at home. Evenings, though, were harder. Alone in the house, every creak and groan of the floorboards reminded me of what was gone. Emily's texts came sporadically. "Can we talk? I'm so sorry, Jack. Please let me explain. I miss you. I'll do anything to fix this." I didn't respond. The truth was, I didn't know how I felt. Some nights, I'd look at her texts and feel a pang of longing, remembering the woman I'd loved for so many years. Other nights, I'd feel nothing but anger, her words ringing hollow against the weight of her actions. One evening, while scrolling through social media, I stumbled across something that froze me in place. A photo of Peter, posted by one of the neighbors, showed him grinning at a backyard barbecue. Next to him was Emily, a drink in her hand and a smile on her face. My chest tightened. She hadn't even waited. The next day, I called Mark. "I need more details about her and Peter. I want to know what they're doing now." Mark hesitated. "Are you sure? Sometimes it's better not to know." "I need to know," I insisted. A few days later, Mark came through. "They've been seeing each other regularly," he said. "Emily's been staying over at his place on weekends. They've also been spotted at a couple of local restaurants. Nothing too public, but it's clear they're not trying to hide anymore." I clenched my jaw, swallowing the rising anger. "Thanks, Mark." After hanging up, I sat in silence, staring at the wall. It wasn't just the betrayal anymore. It was the audacity. The way they carried on as if their actions didn't matter, as if they weren't trampling on everything we'd built together. The next morning, I met with a lawyer. I laid everything out, the photos, the timeline, the texts. "I want to start the process," I said. The lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Claire, nodded. "Based on what you've shown me, this should be fairly straightforward. Do you want to pursue this quietly? Or—" I thought about it. I thought about the way Emily and Peter had humiliated me, the whispers in the neighborhood, the smug grin on Peter's face in that photo. "No," I said firmly. "I want them to feel it." Claire raised an eyebrow but didn't question me. "Understood. Let's start with the formal separation paperwork. We'll go from there." That evening, I sent Emily a text for the first time since she'd left. "We need to talk. Come by the house tomorrow at 7. Her response was almost immediate. "I'll be there." The next day, I prepared for the meeting like I was preparing for battle. I laid out the photos, the texts, the legal documents Claire had drawn up. When Emily walked through the door, she looked nervous, her hands twisting in front of her. "Jack," she began, her voice soft. "Thank you for agreeing to talk." I gestured for her to sit, keeping my face neutral. "I didn't call you here to reconcile, Emily. I called you here to end this." Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw real panic there. "I've started the separation process," I continued, sliding the papers across the table. "You'll need to sign these. I'll be moving forward with a divorce." Her voice trembled. "Jack, please, don't do this. I made a mistake, but we can fix it. I love you." I laughed bitterly. "You love me? You're sleeping at Peter's house, Emily. You gave up on us the moment you kissed him on that porch." Tears streamed down her face, but I felt nothing. "This is over," I said firmly. "I don't care what you and Peter do now, but you will not drag me through this any longer." She signed the papers, her hand shaking with every stroke of the pen. When she was done, she looked at me one last time, her expression a mix of regret and desperation. "I'm sorry, Jack," she whispered. "So am I," I replied, standing to walk her to the door. When she left, I closed the door behind her and leaned against it, the weight of the moment settling over me. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was the first step toward reclaiming my life. Emily had made her choice. Now I was making mine. The days after Emily signed the separation papers felt surreal. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't consumed by the need to dig for answers or brace for confrontations. Instead, I was left with silence. an emptiness that was both freeing and crushing. The neighborhood buzzed with whispers, of course. I caught the sympathetic glances from neighbors on morning walks, the abrupt shifts in conversation when I approached. The story of Emily and Peter was no secret anymore. One afternoon, I decided to clear out some of Emily's belongings. It wasn't about spite. It was about reclaiming the space for myself. I packed her clothes into neat boxes, folded the memories of us together, and set them by the door. But when I reached the dresser, I found a small stack of letters tied with a ribbon. Old notes we'd exchanged early in our relationship. For a moment, I just stared at them, the weight of nostalgia pressing down on me. The words inside those letters were filled with promises of forever, of unwavering love. And now, they felt like relics from a life I could hardly recognize. I threw them into the box with the rest of her things. Later that week, Mark called. "I've got one last update for you," he said. I sighed, weary of more revelations. "What now?" "Peter's moving," Mark said simply. "I guess the heat got to him. Word is, he's leaving town in a couple of weeks." "Good riddance," I muttered, though the news brought little comfort. "What about Emily?" I asked. "She's been laying low," Mark said. "Still seeing Peter, though not as publicly. But once he's gone, who knows?" The thought of Emily alone didn't bring me any satisfaction. For all her betrayal, she was still someone I'd loved deeply. But that love wasn't enough to erase the damage she'd done, or the scars she'd left behind. That weekend, I decided it was time to start rebuilding. I reached out to a few close friends, people I distanced myself from during the chaos of the past few months. Their support was unwavering, and slowly, I began to feel like myself again. One friend, Greg, invited me out for drinks. "You need to get out of that house," he said. "Remind yourself that life goes on." At the bar, surrounded by laughter and music, I felt a flicker of normalcy for the first time in ages. Greg nudged me. "See that girl over there? She's been looking at you for the last 10 minutes. I glanced toward the woman he was talking about. She was attractive, with dark hair and a warm smile. She raised her glass in a silent toast when our eyes met, and I nodded back politely. "Go talk to her," Greg urged. "I'm not ready for that," I said with a small laugh. Greg shrugged. "Fair enough. But one day you will be. And when that day comes, don't let Emily or Peter or any of this hold you back." His words stuck with me as I drove home. I wasn't ready for a new relationship, but I realized I was ready to start healing. Over the next few weeks, I focused on myself. I started running in the mornings, the rhythmic pounding of my feet on the pavement clearing my mind in a way nothing else could. I picked up an old hobby, woodworking, that I'd abandoned years ago. Slowly, the house began to feel like mine again. Each small project a step toward reclaiming my space and my identity. One evening, as I was sanding down a piece of wood for a new coffee table, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Emily. "I heard about Peter leaving. Can we talk? Just once. Please." I stared at the message for a long time before typing a response. "There's nothing left to say, Emily. Take care of yourself." When I hit send, I felt a strange sense of closure. For the first time, I wasn't angry. I wasn't grieving. I was just done. Emily had been a chapter in my life, one filled with love, betrayal, and heartbreak. But it was just that, a chapter. And now it was time to turn the page. As I finished the coffee table that night, I felt a small spark of hope. The future was uncertain, but it was mine to shape. And for the first time in months, I was ready to embrace it. The morning of the final court hearing dawned cold and gray, fitting for what I hoped would be the last chapter of a painful saga. Emily and I met at the courthouse to sign the divorce decree. She looked weary, her once vivid spark dulled by the weight of her choices. As we signed the final papers, she looked at me, her voice trembling. "Jack, I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope you find happiness again. You deserve it." I didn't respond with anger or bitterness. Instead, I nodded. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Emily." It wasn't absolution, but it was closure. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt a strange sense of lightness, as though a heavy weight had finally been lifted. The chapter with Emily was closed, not with a bang or a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet resolve to move forward. That evening, I lit a fire in the backyard pit and sat under the stars, reflecting on everything. The hurt, the betrayal, the anger. All of it was still there, but it no longer consumed me. Instead, it felt like a part of my story, a lesson learned, a scar that would fade with time. The following week, I took a small but symbolic step. I redecorated the house. Gone were the pictures of Emily and me, replaced with photos of friends, family, and the places I wanted to visit. The walls that once held her touch now reflected my new beginning. I didn't expect life to change overnight, but it started to shift in small, meaningful ways. I rekindled old friendships, found joy in my hobbies, and even accepted an invitation to join a community woodworking group. One day, as I was finishing a project, Claire from next door popped by with a basket of fresh herbs from her garden. "These are for the guy who's been turning this house into a work of art," she said with a smile. Her kindness was genuine, and though I wasn't ready for anything beyond friendship, her gesture reminded me that people could still surprise you in the best ways. Months later, as spring rolled in, I realized something profound. The pain didn't define me anymore. I was more than the betrayal, more than the heartbreak. I was someone who had weathered the storm and come out stronger. On a sunny afternoon, I stood in the backyard, looking at the garden I'd planted and the life I was rebuilding. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt at peace. The past was behind me, the future stretched out ahead, and for the first time in a long time, I was ready to live again.